Hello and welcome to Written Words. I'm Helen, and in this video I want to talk about a book that probably very few people watching, if any, have read. The book is Gideon Giles the Roper, which was published in 1841, and it was written by Thomas Miller. I've made a couple of videos before about Thomas Miller and some of his other work, so if it's a subject that's of interest to you, I will put some links to those videos in the description. So why am I so interested in Thomas Miller and in Gideon Giles the Roper? Thomas Miller and I share a hometown, and that is Gainsborough in Lincolnshire. Miller was a working class writer. He was actually a basket maker by trade, and he was largely self-taught. Eventually, in adult life, he decided to move to London in order to seek fame and fortune as a writer. He certainly succeeded as a writer. He was a very prolific writer and published over 40 books in his time. However, he didn't quite make it in terms of fortune, and he died in poverty in London and was buried in a pauper's grave. He is probably most well known today, especially in Gainsborough and around Lincolnshire, for his book Our Old Town, which describes life in the town of Gainsborough in the early 19th century. However, the novel Gideon Giles the Roper was probably the most popular book in his lifetime. And it's a book that is set in the place where he grew up. It is set in the countryside around Gainsborough, the area between Gainsborough and Torksey along the banks of the River Trent. And so in this video, I want to talk a little bit about the book, but I also want to follow in the footsteps of Gideon Giles and visit some of the locations in the story. A couple of weeks ago, the sun came out, so I set out on a little expedition to explore some of the locations in the book, and I took photographs along the way. So in this video, I'm going to share those photographs and some of the corresponding passages in the book. First of all, I'll just explain a little bit about the plot. Gideon Giles, as the name of the book suggests, was a roper by trade, which was a necessary profession in the town of Gainsborough in the 19th century, because Gainsborough was an inland port, so there were plenty of ships and boats coming and going to and from the town, and of course boats need ropes. So Gideon supported his family through his work as a rope maker. However, due to a dispute with the local baron, he ends up losing his job. He worries that because of this his family might end up in the workhouse. So he walks many, many miles in search of a job, but finds nothing. Eventually, a kind pub landlord lends him some money to start his own business. So he does this, and he goes around the local villages selling the ropes that he has made. Unfortunately, what he doesn't realise is that he is breaking a very obscure law by doing this, and some less well-meaning characters catch him doing this and report him to the constable. He is arrested and sent to prison, and his friends and family join forces to try to clear his name. And after much coming and going, there is a happy ending. There are lots of other subplots going on at the same time. There is a romance between Walter Northcote and the Baron's daughter, and there is a plentiful helping of skullduggery on the part of Mr. Baines, the gamekeeper. And the light relief of the story is provided by a very lovable character called Ben Brust, who has a very good heart, but he is a little too fond of a hearty meal. So that's the plot. Let's explore now some of the places that are mentioned in the book. Although Miller was already in London when he was writing this book, it is set in the area where he grew up. In Lincolnshire, mostly. on the banks of the River Trent, between Gainsborough and Torksey, as I've already mentioned. And the river at that point, even today, serves as the boundary between Lincolnshire and Nottinghamshire. The characters are mostly poor, working-class village folk, in an age before cars and trains, so they do a lot of walking, occasionally covering some impressive distances, as we'll see in a moment. So as we go off on our little expedition to explore some of the places in the story, if you're familiar with the area, I hope that you recognise the places from the descriptions in the story. And if you're not from the area, I hope it piques your interest and makes you want to know it better. The story actually opens not in Gainsborough but in Newark, in the old Fallow Deer Inn, where we are introduced to a couple of the characters. It was early on a fine May morning, nearly 3 years ago, when a young man of gentlemanlike appearance alighted from one of the northern mails at the front of the old Fallow Deer Inn, Newark, a comfortable-looking public house, as all know who have travelled that road, which faces the sweet south and overlooks one of those rich pastoral landscapes such as are to be found nowhere but in England. So we have a very typical English scene of a pub surrounded by rich pastoral countryside. We don't stay in Newark for very long, however, because the characters Ben Brust and Walter Northcott make their way back to Lincolnshire, following the river northwards. And they call at many villages along the way, which are still there today. They call at Collingham, Besthorpe, Torksey, Nath and Lee before arriving at the Baron's estate of Burton Woodhouse. So let's follow them as they make their way through all those villages. He heard the voices of little children as he passed through Collingham. A mother was singing to her child. A few miles further and he saw a labourer returning to his cottage. A little boy ran up to meet him at the gate and leapt into his arms. He saw the fond father kiss the child. "God bless them," said Gideon. Ben was so happy that he gave a full account of the dinner at Besthorpe and laughed heartily at the trick the landlord had played him, and he ate so much and drank so deeply of the Justice's strong old ale that Gideon was compelled to see him home. The worthy host of the Fallow Deer had known the young gentleman's father in former years, and now kindly remembered that he had some business with Farmer Watkinson of Torksey, which was within 2 miles of Burton Woodhouse. "And now," continued he, "as the day is fine, I'll just have yon little black pony of mine put in the gig and drive over, if you've no objection to take a seat beside me." "I must leave all to Providence," said Gideon with a sigh. He passed through the cornfields beyond Marton, along that picturesque footpath which is overhung by tall old trees and shaded by lofty hedges. He heard the lazy rumbling of the wains along the heavy sand road, the crack of the whip and the gee-hove of the drivers, and wondered when he should hear those voices again. His little bundle, containing the few necessities he was compelled to carry, was slung on a stout walking stick, which rested on his shoulder, and he walked along at a rapid pace. The moss-covered walls of Nath Park were soon left behind. The home field, bordered with willows that seemed to elbow out the River Trent, and the rich marshes that broadened out to his left. Few were astir as he went through the picturesque village of Lee, with its primitive cottages of stud and mud, and low thatched roofs covered with 100 varieties of moss. He glanced at the church clock on the hillside. It was just on the stroke of 5, and he was soon pursuing his way with long and rapid strides over the fields which skirt the foot of the long plantation. Then he came in sight of the oil mills, the square old tower of the church, and the straggling roofs of Gainsborough. So those are some of the villages along the River Trent. In addition to these places, there is also a selection of other villages in the area that are mentioned throughout the story as the characters travel here and there, including this passage. The constable smiled, made a low bow, and thanked his worship for the compliment, and added, "I see it clear enough now, but Gideon was not at Gainsborough, and I heard of him selling his goods in both Lee and Nath yesterday, and can bring witnesses to prove it." "He speaks but the truth," replied Gideon, "nor will I, whatever may befall me, shelter myself behind a falsehood. Today I have been calling at the villages of Beckingham, Sawnby, Bowl, and Wheatley, nor did I enter Gainsborough further than the town end to cross the bridge. I am unconscious of having done wrong. The little capital which was lent me, and which I wished to pay back as speedily as possible, compelled me to seek the readiest market for my goods, and I have worked early and late to make up for the time I lose in hawking them around the villages. Like most people who live in this area, I have travelled to and through many of those villages, but I've done it mostly in a car. The journey around all the different villages that Gideon would have walked would have amounted to a lot of miles. The main action of the story, however, is centred around the estate of Burton Woodhouse, and that is the baronial estate of Sir Edward Lee. A strange coincidence indeed, as the current MP for Gainsborough is Sir Edward Lee, although spelt slightly differently. Burton Woodhouse is not to be found on any of the maps that I've managed to get hold of. However, we do know roughly its location. It's somewhere in the vicinity of Nath and Lee and Marton. And if you are travelling today along the A159, which leads from Gainsborough to Lincoln, just between Nath and Marton, there is an estate on a hillside overlooking the river, with a very stately looking house on private parkland, and that area is called Gate Burton. So whether or not that is what Miller had in mind when he was writing the story, it certainly was what I had in mind when I was reading it. The next day found Walter Northcote by the side of Amy Lee, and every hour he appeared to rise higher in the estimation of her father. The hall of Burton Woodhouse seemed to look as cheerful as it did in former days, and a smile once more sat upon the still beautiful, though care-marked countenance of Lady Lee. The evening was so fine, Lavinia proposed that they should take tea on the lawn, and the table and chairs were soon set out on the delicious greensward. When Gideon first loses his job, as I mentioned already, he sets out on a long journey in search of work, calling at lots of different places along the way. He begins in Gainsborough, where there was a large rope works. Not finding any work there, he then pays a toll to cross the bridge over into Nottinghamshire, which he considers a little unfair as he's only going on foot. From there he walks to Retford, Worksop, and when he arrives in Mansfield, he quite understandably complains that his feet are sore. When I looked this journey up on Google Maps, it reckoned that was about 40 miles, so it's not surprising that his feet hurt at the end of it. He called at the ropery at the entrance of the town. The men were already at work, and he found to his sorrow that he had no chance of a job there. Mr. Furley had discharged 2 of his men on the previous Saturday night, and neither of them had been able to get work in the town. He paid his halfpenny at the bridge without grumbling at the imposition, for he thought if the inhabitants of Gainsborough sat down so quietly to be plundered, he had no right to complain, though he knew that foot passengers ought, according to the terms on which the bridge was built, to have passed over toll-free years ago. "These things must be altered ere long," muttered Gideon. He turned down the steep path at the end of the bridge, past another ropery which was not yet opened, and along the hauling path beside the Trent. Then struck off past osier bolts and rich meadows, in the direction of Bowl and Wheatley, past the tall maypole, and so on over the wide space of cornlands which stretch as far as the eye can reach without either bound or enclosure, then along the canal side to Welham, and reached East Retford at 8 o'clock. The road for the next 7 miles was beautiful, winding through the picturesque villages of Babworth and Marton, and beside the rich domains of Clumber Park. Gideon Giles reached Worksop by 11 o'clock. That morning he had walked above 20 miles, but could obtain no work. The answer at Worksop Ropery was, they had set a man on the day before, and he had only the promise of a week's work. Gideon refused the 6pence the poor man offered him, adding, "Nay, if you are but to stay a week, you will soon need it. I will travel further." He passed on to Norton, and came to the village of Warsop, where he took his dinner. He finished the remainder of the provisions in his bundle, drank a pint of ale, and smoked a pipe of tobacco, and found himself much refreshed. He then proceeded to Mansfield, called at the rope walk, and was told that trade was so slack they could not keep even one journeyman, that the apprentice, who had but 3 months to serve of his time, would have to go on tramp when his time was out. The master and his son had but employment enough for themselves. "I must try Nottingham," said Gideon, and he turned his face in the direction of Sherwood Forest, perhaps trod the very path which Robin Hood and his merry men had traversed. But Gideon's feet were hot and blistered, and his heart too sad to think of the belted outlaw. His thoughts were of the safety of Ellen, and how he should obtain bread for his family. Gideon is not the only character who goes on long walks, however. When Gideon is carted off to Girton House of Correction, Ellen, his daughter, and Ben Brust walk there to visit him. In the book, certainly in my copy of the book, it's called Girton House of Correction, although I think it's possibly more likely to be Curtain House of Correction. There is plenty of historical records for a Curtain House of Correction, and when we see the route that the characters take to get there, it makes much more sense. The two travellers started at an early hour, Ben laden with provisions, and Ellen carrying all she could gather together in her little basket, to make her poor father comfortable. Ben had an order to deliver at Lee about some sheep, and to call at Willingham to say the bullock was too dear, besides delivering a message at Glentworth, which caused them to take the most roundabout road, so they struck off above Lee, made for Fillingham, and threaded their way along the high range of hills on which the ancient city of Lincoln is situated, bearing northward in the direction of Spittal. The beautiful scenery through which they passed had but few charms for the daughter of the poor roper, though Ben made her halt on the brow of the hill beyond Fillingham, which overlooks as beautiful a landscape as ever the imagination of painter conceived, a perfect, quiet and thorough English scene. In the valley, and halfway up the hill, stretched the beautiful village, as if sleeping in the morning sunshine under its canopy of picturesque trees, every one of which seemed to droop over some thatched cottage, or partially to screen the roof of some farmhouse. The houses, built of the self-same stone as the cliffs on which they stand, which stretch for miles along the hills, now green or grey just as some little quarry was revealed in the sunshine, and broke the rich colouring of the steep pasturage. Below spread a sheet of sweet water, shining like silver in the distance, while deep wooded lanes went dipping down the hillsides, and led to lovely granges and rich fields where corn grew, and hay was in the cock, and the red and white clover flowers spread over many a rich acre, only varied by the yellow kecks. So, as well as explaining the route that the characters took, we also get a sample of some of Miller's very lyrical writing in that passage. A gypsy encampment also features at intervals in the story, led by the dubious character of Black Boswell. "You have heard of Black Boswell," continued the squire, "the leader of the gypsies. He is encamped on the opposite side of the wood. What think you of him? He is one of my particular friends, and would either cut a throat or break into a house at my bidding." Black Boswell clearly has a reputation as a bit of a lawless character. However, the opinions of the characters do vary as far as the gypsies are concerned. "Black Boswell's not so bad as some folks think him to be," said the host. "He may take the squire's money and destroy his game, but he's always turned out to be the friend of the weak party at last. Beside, if he was ever so disposed to do an injury, there are those among the gypsies who would oppose him, unless it was something that affected the whole tribe. They may make free with a little poultry in a hard winter, milk a cow, or pick up a stray sheep, and rob a potato or turnip field when they are hard pushed for a meal. But there are worse-hearted folks on earth than these gypsies, and I have seen a good deal of them in my time." As is the nature of gypsy communities, their encampment moves around, but it seems to have been based somewhere around the woodland near the village of Lee. They walked on together to the camp, and were soon busied in the removal of the tents, and packing up the few articles in their possession, for the contemplated movements of Black Boswell required more secrecy than the heath afforded, and they made for the old and gloomy wood of Lee, in the centre of which stands a wild wooded valley, supposed to have been a fish pond in the olden times, and which is still called the Dark Dell. Gypsies are also mentioned by George Eliot in The Mill on the Floss, which was also set in this area. So the presence of the gypsy community is something that I would be interested to learn a little bit more about at some point. Moving on now to pubs. There are quite a few pubs mentioned throughout the story. The story opens, as we've already seen, in the old Fallow Deer Inn in Newark. The characters call at the Old Black Bull in Besthorpe several times in the story. It's also called the Old Black Bell in some places, which is presumably a typo. When I visited modern-day Besthorpe, there was no sign of an Old Black Bull or an Old Black Bell, but there was a pub on the main road. The pub on the main road today is called the Lord Nelson. They soon arrived at Besthorpe, and put up at the Old Black Bell, the very house where Ben recovered his boots and pummelled the tinker. The sheep were put into a neighbouring paddock, and Ben began to inquire after dinner. It is the White Swan at Torksey, however, which is Gideon's local pub. It features several times in the story, and it is still there today. William walked down to the White Swan and called for half a pint of ale and a slice of bread and cheese, and while he was eating it, told the company how he had been invited to dine with Ben Brust, and said, "I believe he's eaten up all the dinner and gone and laid him down." "Very likely," said the landlord. "He came here about 12 for a quart of ale, and said that he expected you, and that his wife had bought 2.5 pounds off a prime loin of mutton, and it was just done to a turn when he was here. But I dare say you was behind your time, and he thought you wouldn't come, so ate it for fear it should spoil." "Why, dang his buttons," said cousin William. "I was there to the very minute, and then I was too late." He finished his bread and cheese, and called Benjamin everything but a gentleman. A little extract from the scene where Ben's appetite gets the better of him. Of course, the constant backdrop of the story is the River Trent. And Miller, being a very lyrical, poetic writer, includes some beautiful descriptions of the Trent and the scenery around it. So let's enjoy just a little sample of that. The River Trent curved its silver arm in the morning sunshine, and flowed along with a calm, sleepy motion through rich and expansive meadowlands, where the gold of the kingcup and the radiant whiteness of the daisy mingled with the varied green of the grass, over which the eye wandered with delight, until it was lost amid the sunny slopes of the uplands, the dim foliage of the far-off trees, and the dazzling distance of hill and sky. Despite his poor working-class background, Miller was very well read, and we can see this coming through at various points in the story. He quotes a selection of writers along the way, including this reference from Shakespeare, which talks about the Trent, which is from Henry IV, Part 2. The boat was by this time gliding around the huge arm which encircles Lee Marsh, one of the largest bends in the River Trent, since the cranking elbow, which Hotspur and Glendower quarrelled about in Shakespeare's Henry IV, has been cut off. The river is the setting for a rather comical scene at the end of the story, when Ben and Gideon, the most unlikely sailors, jump into a boat and try to rescue Walter Northcote, who, it turns out, doesn't need rescuing after all. So let us end our wanderings on a lighter note with the lovely Ben Brust. "Come here, you thieves!" shouted Ben Brust as he stood with a boat hook uplifted in the moonlight. "Let me once get hold of any of you with this, and I'll land you here as easy as I would a roach. Hard over with the helm, Gideon! Lay to!" continued he, calling to cousin William. "Now, Farmer Kitchen, one good pull, and I shall hook that thief of a captain." "Why, Domham, they're making fun on us," said Ben, staring in astonishment at the hardihood of the captain, who had by this time rowed round the heavy lighter, and come so near as to touch their oars. "Pull ahead," said the captain. The men lay to with all their strength, and the boat shot forward like a racehorse. "We shall lose him! We shall lose him!" shouted Ben. "Oh, if I had but those thieves ashore! But see, they're coming back. They mean showing us fight after all." And off went Ben's jacket in an instant. "Now," said Ben, "just show me which is the thief of a captain, and leave me to deal with him." "Lay down your boat hook, Ben," said Walter when they came alongside, "and lend me your hand to mount this clumsy craft. These are all friends of mine," added he, pointing to the crew. "Are they?" said Ben, scarcely believing his eyes. "Then give us your fist, my hearties," continued he, seizing the hand of the captain, while he added, "2 minutes ago I would have given all I'm worth in the world to have broken your head, but if I'd known you'd been a friend of Master Walter's, I would sooner have eaten my hand than I would have hurt you." And so we leave Ben and Gideon now, as the sun sets over the River Trent. I hope you enjoyed the little extracts from the story and following in the footsteps of Gideon Giles. If you are interested in reading the book, it is unfortunately out of print these days. There are copies in reference sections around the libraries of Lincolnshire, especially in Gainsborough, and there is a facsimile copy online, which I'll put a link to in the description. I personally read this version from Forgotten Books, which specialises in publishing facsimile copies of out-of-print works, making them available to modern-day readers, and there are some very interesting titles in there. So thank you very much for joining me on this journey. As ever, there are several more videos in the pipeline. There's going to be a little bit of Yorkshire dialect coming up. I'm also going to be exploring the world of translation and many more subjects related to language and literature. So thank you very much for joining me in this video. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. And in the meantime, happy reading and happy writing.